Close your eyes and drift with me northward, beyond the gentle hills of familiar lands, to a place where the aurora borealis dances across endless winter nights and the midnight sun refuses to set during the brief, precious summers. Here, in the fjords and forests of ancient Scandinavia, where the scent of pine mingles with the salt spray of restless seas, a people emerged who would reshape the medieval world with their longships and their dreams. Tonight, we journey together through the mists of time to discover not just the Vikings of legend, those fierce warriors who struck terror into the hearts of monks and kings, but the fuller story of a remarkable civilization. We'll walk through their smoky longhouses, sail aboard their elegant ships, and witness the transformation of raiders into traders, of pagans into Christians, of tribal chieftains into the founders of kingdoms that endure to this day. Let the gentle rhythm of oars upon dark water carry you into their world, before the first Viking longship ever cut through foreign waters, before the first raid on a distant shore. There existed a land where myth and reality intertwined, like the serpentine patterns carved into weathered runestones. In the forests and fjords of ancient Scandinavia, during those quiet centuries before the storm of expansion, a unique culture was slowly taking shape, one that would eventually echo across the known world. Imagine, if you will, the Scandinavia of the 6th and 7th centuries. The Roman Empire, that great organizing force of the ancient world, had never truly penetrated these northern reaches. Here, beyond the reach of Roman roads and Roman law, communities lived according to rhythms far older than any written code. The endless cycle of seasons, the brief, intense summers when the sun barely set, the long, contemplative winters when darkness reigned for months, created a people uniquely attuned to the fundamental patterns of light and shadow, abundance and scarcity, life and death. In these northern lands, the boundary between the natural and supernatural remained beautifully fluid. Sacred groves dotted the landscape, where ancient oaks stood as living pillars supporting the sky. It was here, according to the old stories, that Odin had hung himself from the world tree, sacrificing himself to himself in his quest for wisdom. These weren't merely tales told around winter fires. They were living truths that shaped how people understood their place in the cosmos. The burial mounds that dotted the Scandinavian landscape tell us much about these pre-Viking peoples. Great chieftains were laid to rest with their weapons, their jewelry, their ships, everything they would need for the journey to the afterlife. But more than that, these burials speak to a sophisticated understanding of death, not as an ending, but as a transformation. The dead were not gone. They were simply traveling to another realm, one that remained intimately connected to the world of the living. In the archaeological record, we find evidence of communities that were already remarkably sophisticated in their understanding of both the practical and the sacred. They were skilled metalworkers, creating intricate jewelry and weapons that combined function with beauty. They were talented shipbuilders, developing the sleek, shallow-drafted vessels that would eventually carry their descendants across oceans. They were innovative farmers, adapting to the challenging northern climate with techniques that maximized the brief growing season. But perhaps most importantly, they were master storytellers. In the long winter nights, when families gathered around central hearths while wind howled through the darkness outside, the ancient tales were passed down from generation to generation. These stories weren't merely entertainment, they were the cultural DNA of a people, encoding everything from practical navigation techniques to complex moral philosophy. The gods of the Norse pantheon reflected the values and concerns of the people who worshipped them. Odin, the All-Father, was a god of wisdom and war, but also of poetry and magic. A divine figure who understood that true power came not from brute strength alone, but from knowledge, cunning, and the ability to see connections others missed. Thor, the Thunderer, represented the more straightforward virtues of courage and protection, the defender of both gods and humans against the forces of chaos. Freya and Freyja embodied the life-giving forces of fertility and abundance, reminding their worshippers that, even in the harsh north, life would always find a way to renew itself. These weren't distant, unknowable deities dwelling in some remote heaven. They were active participants in the daily life of their people, gods who faced the same fundamental challenges as mortals. The threat of death, the need for courage in the face of overwhelming odds, the search for meaning in an often chaotic world. The Norse gods were not immortal in the way we often think of divinity. They too would face their ending at Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods. This knowledge gave Norse religion a particularly poignant quality, a recognition that even the divine was subject to the great cycles of creation and destruction that governed all existence. The social structure of these early Scandinavian communities was complex and nuanced, far from the simple warrior society often depicted in popular culture. Yes, martial prowess was valued, but so too were the skills of the craftsman, the wisdom of the law speaker, the foresight of the merchant. Women held positions of respect and authority that would have been unthinkable in many other medieval societies. They could own property, initiate divorce, and participate in the complex legal proceedings that governed community life. The Thing assemblies, gatherings where free men came together to make laws, settle disputes, and make collective decisions, represented one of the earliest forms of democratic governance in medieval Europe. These weren't mere advisory bodies, they wielded real power, capable of overruling even the most powerful chieftains when justice demanded it. The concept of individual rights, balanced against collective responsibility, so central to modern democratic thought, was already being worked out in these ancient assemblies. As the 8th century dawned, these scattered communities began to feel the pressure of change. Population growth was pushing against the limits of available farmland. Improved shipbuilding techniques were opening new possibilities for long-distance travel. Political instability in neighboring regions was creating both opportunities and challenges. Most importantly, a new generation of leaders was emerging. Men and women who possessed both the traditional skills of their ancestors and the vision to imagine something entirely new. The transformation that would create the Vikings wasn't sudden or violent. It was a gradual evolution, as natural and inevitable as the changing of the seasons. Communities that had lived in relative isolation for centuries began to look outward, drawn by reports of wealthy monasteries and prosperous trading centers across the sea. The same skills that had allowed them to survive in the harsh northern climate, adaptability, resourcefulness, courage in the face of uncertainty, would now carry them to the far corners of the known world. But even as they prepared for this great expansion, they carried with them the essential wisdom of their ancestors. The values encoded in their myths, the social structures developed over centuries of communal life, the spiritual understanding that saw the sacred in the everyday, all of this would travel with them in their longships, shaping their interactions with the peoples they would encounter and the societies they would create. The age of the Vikings was about to begin, but it would be built upon foundations laid in the quiet centuries that came before, when the North was still a land of mist and memory, where the old gods warped among their people and the future was still taking shape in the dreams of those who dared to imagine it. In the gentle hours before dawn, when the mist still clung to the fjords and the first birds began their tentative songs, the rhythm of life in pre-Viking Scandinavia unfolded with the predictable comfort of ancient ritual. This was a world governed not by the artificial divisions of clock and calendar, but by the deeper patterns of season and weather, daylight and darkness, the eternal cycle of planting and harvest that had sustained northern peoples for countless generations. The Longhouse stood as the heart of this carefully ordered existence, a structure that was both practical shelter and sacred space. Imagine walking through the heavy wooden door of such a dwelling in the early morning light. Your eyes would need time to adjust to the perpetual twilight within, lit only by the central hearth that never truly died, even in the depths of summer. The air would be thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke, cooking food, and the bodies of people and animals sharing the same roof. A combination that might seem overwhelming to modern senses, but which spoke to our ancestors of safety, community, and home. The longhouse was designed around the fundamental principle of survival through cooperation. Extended families, sometimes numbering 30 or 40 individuals, lived together in carefully organized sections. The central hall, dominated by the great hearth, served as the communal heart where meals were shared, stories were told, and the most important decisions were made. Here, the head of the household would sit in the high seat, a chair that was both practical furniture and sacred symbol, connecting the family to their ancestors and their gods. But the longhouse was more than just a dwelling. It was a microcosm of the entire community. The women's quarters, located in the rear of the building, were centers of economic activity where skilled artisans worked at their looms, creating the fine textiles that were both practical necessities and valuable trade goods. The rhythmic sound of the loom, the gentle thud of the beater bar against the warp threads, provided a constant background melody to daily life. These weren't merely utilitarian objects being created, they were works of art, incorporating complex patterns and brilliant colors that reflected the aesthetic sophistication of their creators. The men's work was equally varied and skilled. In the workshops attached to the longhouse, craftsmen worked iron and wood, creating everything from simple farming tools to elaborate weapons and jewelry. The blacksmith held a position of particular respect, for his was the ancient art of transforming raw ore into useful objects. A process that seemed almost magical to those who witnessed it. The hammer blows against the anvil provided another rhythmic element to the soundscape of daily life, a percussion that spoke of creativity and transformation. As the seasons turned, the focus of community life shifted with the demands of survival. Spring brought the urgent work of planting, when every available hand was needed to prepare the fields and sow the precious seeds that would determine whether the coming winter would be one of abundance or scarcity. The northern growing season was brief and unforgiving. There were no second chances if the timing was wrong. This created a culture of careful planning and meticulous attention to detail that would serve the Vikings well in their later maritime adventures. Summer was the season of intense activity. The long days, when the sun barely set, allowed for extended periods of work. Hay had to be cut and stored, the crucial food source that would keep livestock alive through the long winter months. Fish had to be caught and preserved, using techniques developed over generations to ensure that the bounty of the sea would be available year-round. The preservation of food was perhaps the most critical skill in this northern world, for the ability to store surplus from the season of plenty meant the difference between life and death during the lean months. But summer was also the season of travel and trade. The same ships that would later carry Viking raiders across the North Sea were first developed for more peaceful purposes. To carry goods between scattered communities, to maintain the social connections that bound the region together, and to participate in the complex networks of exchange that linked Scandinavia to the wider world. Even in these early centuries, northern merchants were traveling remarkable distances, following rivers deep into the Russian interior, crossing the Baltic to trade with the peoples of the eastern shore. The autumn brought the harvest, a time of both celebration and anxiety. The success or failure of the year's crops would determine the fate of the entire community. This was when the complex social bonds that held these societies together were most clearly visible. Families shared labor, helping one another bring in the harvest before the first killing frost. The wealthy were expected to provide for the less fortunate, ensuring that no one in the community would starve during the coming winter. These weren't merely acts of charity, They were investments in the social fabric that made survival possible. Winter, the longest and most challenging season, was also the most culturally rich. With the outdoor work of farming and trading largely suspended, the long, dark months became a time for the activities that defined the community's identity. This was the season of storytelling, when the ancient myths and legends were passed down to the next generation. The skald, the community's poet and historian, would recite the great stories of gods and heroes, weaving new tales that celebrated recent achievements and preserved the memory of those who had gone before. The legal system of these early Scandinavian communities was sophisticated and democratic in ways that would not be matched in most of Europe for centuries to come. The Thing assemblies brought together free men to make laws, settle disputes, and make collective decisions about the community's future. These weren't mere advisory bodies, they wielded real power, capable of overruling even the most powerful chieftains when justice demanded it. The concept of individual rights balanced against collective responsibility, so central to modern democratic thought, was already being worked out in these ancient assemblies. Women in this society held a position of respect and authority that was remarkable for its time. They could own property, initiate divorce, and participate in the complex legal proceedings that governed community life. The vulva, the female seer who could communicate with the spirit world, held a position of particular reverence. These women were believed to possess the gift of prophecy, the ability to see beyond the veil that separated the world of the living from the realm of the dead and the divine. The religious life of these communities was deeply integrated into the rhythms of daily existence. The gods were not distant figures dwelling in some remote heaven. They were active participants in the daily life of their people. Odin might appear as a wandering stranger, testing the hospitality of a household. Thor's hammer could be heard in the crash of thunder during summer storms. Freya and Freyja blessed the fields and the flocks, ensuring the fertility that made life possible. Seasonal festivals marked the turning points of the year, great communal celebrations that brought scattered communities together. The summer solstice was a time of joy and thanksgiving, when the sun reached its highest point and the power of life was at its strongest. The winter solstice brought Yule, a celebration of the returning light and the promise that spring would come again. These festivals weren't mere parties, they were essential rituals that renewed the bonds between the community and the divine forces that governed their world. As the 8th century drew to a close, subtle changes began to ripple through this carefully ordered existence. Population growth was creating pressure on available farmland. Improved shipbuilding techniques were opening new possibilities for long-distance travel. Political instability in neighboring regions was creating both opportunities and challenges. Most importantly, a new generation of leaders was emerging. Men and women who possessed both the traditional skills of their ancestors and the vision to imagine something entirely new. The transformation that would create the Vikings wasn't a sudden rupture with the past, but a gradual evolution of the skills and values that had sustained northern peoples for generations. The same attention to detail that went into preserving fish for the winter would be applied to planning raids on distant shores. The same cooperative spirit that made the harvest possible would enable the complex logistics of long-distance expeditions. The same respect for individual initiative balanced against collective responsibility would shape the governance of new settlements from Iceland to Kiev. The age of expansion was about to begin, but it would be built upon the solid foundations of daily life, the rhythms of survival and community that had sustained the North for countless generations. In the quiet activities of the longhouse, in the seasonal cycles of agricultural life, in the ancient rituals that connected the community to their gods and ancestors, lay the seeds of the remarkable adventure that was about to unfold. The morning of June 8th, 793 CE, dawned like any other along the wind-swept coast of Northumbria. The monks of Lindisfarne went about their daily prayers, Their thoughts turned toward the eternal rather than the temporal, their stone monastery standing as a beacon of learning and faith in a world that still trembled with the echoes of older, wilder times. The island sanctuary had known peace for generations, protected by the very isolation that made it a perfect refuge for those seeking communion with the divine. But on this particular morning, as the mist began to lift from the North Sea, dark shapes appeared on the horizon, shapes that would forever change the course of medieval history. The ships that emerged from the morning haze were unlike anything the English had seen before. Long and sleek, with shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate rivers and coastal waters with equal ease, they moved with predatory grace across the waves. Their dragon-headed prows cut through the water like living creatures, while their striped sails caught the wind with an efficiency that spoke of centuries of refinement. These were not mere boats, but works of art, technological marvels that represented the culmination of generations of northern craftsmanship. The men who leaped from these vessels onto the rocky shores of Lindisfarne were equally remarkable. They moved with the fluid coordination of warriors who had trained together since childhood, their weapons gleaming with the particular sheen of superior metallurgy. These were not barbarians driven by simple bloodlust, but skilled professionals executing a carefully planned operation. They knew exactly what they had come for. The gold and silver that adorned the monastery's altars, the precious manuscripts that could be ransomed back to their owners, the prestige that would come from striking at the heart of Christian England. But to understand the true significance of this moment, we must look beyond the immediate drama of the raid itself. The attack on Lindisfarne was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of changes that had been building in Scandinavian society for decades. The raiders who struck that morning were the products of a culture in transition, one that was beginning to feel the pressure of population growth, political instability, and expanding horizons. The Scandinavia of the late 8th century was a land of contradictions. The old ways of life, based on subsistence farming and local trade, were proving insufficient to support a growing population. Inheritance laws that divided property among multiple heirs were creating ever smaller farms, forcing younger sons to seek their fortunes elsewhere. At the same time, improvements in shipbuilding technology were making long-distance travel more feasible than ever before. The same vessels that had once been used primarily for coastal trading were now capable of crossing open oceans. Political instability was another crucial factor. The rise of strong kingdoms in Denmark and southern Sweden was disrupting traditional patterns of authority, creating both opportunities and challenges for ambitious young men. Those who found themselves on the losing side of political struggles often faced a choice between submission and exile. Many chose exile, but exile in the 8th century didn't necessarily mean wandering as a rootless vagabond. For those with the skills and courage to seize them, opportunities beckoned across the sea. The expansion of Frankish power under Charlemagne had created a buffer zone between Scandinavia and the rich lands of Central Europe, but it had also revealed the wealth that lay beyond the northern frontiers. Frankish merchants brought tales of prosperous cities and wealthy monasteries, of lands where gold and silver seemed to flow like water. For a generation of northern warriors raised on stories of heroic adventure, these tales were irresistible. The raid on Lindisfarne was thus not a random act of violence, but a carefully calculated venture. The raiders had done their homework, learning about the monastery's wealth, its defenses or lack thereof, and the best time to strike. They had waited for the right weather conditions, the right tides, and the right moment in the seasonal cycle. This was economic warfare disguised as adventure, a business venture that happened to involve swords and shields. The immediate impact of the raid was devastating. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with a mixture of shock and horror, describing how the heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. But the deeper impact would be felt for generations to come. The success of the Lindisfarne raid proved that the wealthy centers of Christian Europe were vulnerable to attack from the sea. More importantly, it demonstrated that such attacks could be highly profitable. News of the raid's success spread quickly through the networks of kinship and alliance that connected Scandinavian communities. The warriors who had participated returned home with wealth beyond their wildest dreams, but also with something equally valuable: detailed knowledge of foreign coasts, political conditions, and defensive capabilities. This intelligence would prove crucial for the larger expeditions that would follow. The psychological impact of the raid was equally important. For the first time in centuries, Christian Europe was forced to confront the reality that its heartland was not secure. The monastery at Lindisfarne was not just a religious center, but a symbol of Christian civilization itself. The fact that pagan raiders could strike at such a target with impunity sent shockwaves through the medieval world. Kings and nobles who had never given much thought to naval defense suddenly found themselves frantically building coastal fortifications. But the raiders themselves were also changed by their experience. The success of the Lindisfarne raid proved that the wider world was not an impenetrable mystery, but a place where skilled and determined men could carve out their own destinies. The same qualities that had made them successful farmers and traders: careful planning, attention to detail, willingness to take calculated risks, could also make them successful raiders and conquerors. The years following Lindisfarne saw a rapid escalation in the scale and sophistication of northern raids. Individual adventurers gave way to organized fleets. Single-ship raids evolved into complex, multi-pronged campaigns. The knowledge gained from early expeditions was pooled and refined, creating a body of expertise that would make later adventures possible. Maps were drawn, sailing directions were memorized, and intelligence networks were established that would serve Viking raiders for generations to come. The transformation was not limited to military affairs. The influx of wealth from successful raids began to reshape Scandinavian society itself. Young men who returned from expeditions with chests full of silver could afford to marry earlier, to buy better land, to establish themselves as men of substance in their communities. This created a positive feedback loop. Success in raiding led to higher social status, which in turn attracted more followers for future expeditions. The cultural impact was equally profound. The old stories of heroes and gods suddenly seemed less like ancient myths and more like relevant guides for contemporary action. The tales of Odin's wanderings, Thor's battles, and the adventures of legendary heroes took on new meaning for men who were themselves venturing into unknown territories and facing impossible odds. The skalds who had once sung of imaginary heroes now had real adventures to celebrate, real warriors whose deeds could rival those of the gods themselves. The weapons and tactics that had been developed for local conflicts were adapted for use in foreign campaigns. The famous Viking round shield, with its iron boss and leather grip, proved perfectly suited to the kind of close-quarters combat that characterized raids on fortified positions. The sea axe, a single-edged fighting knife, became a standard part of every warrior's equipment. Most importantly, the emphasis on mobility and surprise that had characterized traditional Scandinavian warfare proved devastatingly effective against enemies who were accustomed to more static forms of combat. As the 8th century drew to a close, it became clear that the raid on Lindisfarne had not been an isolated incident, but the beginning of a new age. The same forces that had driven those first raiders across the North Sea were continuing to operate, creating pressure for ever larger and more ambitious expeditions. The success of the early raids had demonstrated that the wider world was rich with opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. The age of small-scale raiding was about to give way to something far more significant, an era of systematic exploration and conquest that would reshape the political map of medieval Europe. The Vikings were no longer content to be merely raiders. They were becoming settlers, traders, and kings. The seeds planted at Lindisfarne were about to bloom into a transformation that would echo through the centuries, carrying the influence of northern culture to the far corners of the known world and beyond. The 9th century dawned with the promise of transformation. As the scattered raids of the previous generation began to coalesce into something far more systematic and far-reaching, what had begun as opportunistic strikes by individual warbands was evolving into a coordinated expansion that would ultimately stretch from the frozen shores of Greenland to the sun-baked markets of Constantinople. The Vikings were no longer merely raiders. They were becoming explorers, settlers, and state builders on a scale that would have seemed impossible to their predecessors. The key to this remarkable expansion lay in the evolution of Viking shipbuilding technology. The longship, that masterpiece of medieval engineering, had reached a level of sophistication that made previously impossible journeys routine. These vessels were marvels of practical design, shallow-drafted enough to navigate rivers and coastal waters, yet sturdy enough to cross open oceans. Their flexibility came from a clinker-built construction technique that allowed the hull to flex with the waves rather than fighting them, making them far more seaworthy than the rigid vessels used by other medieval peoples. But the longship was more than just a technological achievement. It was a perfect reflection of Viking values and priorities. Like the culture that created it, the longship emphasized speed, adaptability, and the ability to thrive in challenging environments. Its dragon-headed prow was not merely decorative, but served a psychological purpose, striking fear into enemies while boosting the morale of the crew. The ship's shallow draft allowed it to appear suddenly in places where no enemy would expect to find it, striking quickly and disappearing before organized resistance could be mounted. The navigational skills of Viking seafarers were equally impressive. Operating in an age before compass or sextant, they had developed techniques for finding their way across vast stretches of open water, using only the sun, stars, and their intimate knowledge of wind patterns, wave formations, and wildlife behavior. They could read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of land beyond the horizon, the flight patterns of seabirds, the color of clouds, the smell of vegetation carried on the wind. These skills had been passed down through generations of northern seafarers, refined through countless voyages into an art form that seemed almost mystical to outsiders. The expansion began in earnest during the early decades of the 9th century, as increasingly large and well-organized fleets set out from Scandinavian ports. The pattern was remarkably consistent across different regions. Initial raids would be followed by the establishment of winter camps, which would then evolve into permanent settlements. The same flexibility that characterized Viking shipbuilding was evident in their approach to expansion. They were equally comfortable as raiders, traders, or colonists, adapting their strategies to local conditions and opportunities. In the West, Viking fleets found rich pickings along the coasts of Ireland and Scotland. The Irish Sea became a virtual Viking lake, with Norse strongholds established at strategic points from the Orkney Islands to the Isle of Man. Dublin, Cork, and Waterford began as Viking trading posts, their Norse names still echoing in the modern Irish landscape. These weren't merely military outposts, but thriving commercial centres that connected the scattered communities of the Irish Sea region to the broader networks of medieval trade. The establishment of these bases allowed for increasingly ambitious expeditions. From their strongholds in the Irish Sea, Viking fleets could strike at targets along the Welsh coast, conduct raids into the English Midlands, or venture further west into the unexplored Atlantic. Each successful expedition brought back not only wealth but also knowledge, detailed information about coastlines, political conditions, and opportunities for future ventures. The discovery and settlement of Iceland represented perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Viking expansion. In 874 CE, A Norwegian chieftain named Ingolfur Arnason landed on the shores of an island that had been uninhabited by humans but rich in natural resources. The settlement of Iceland was not a random event, but a carefully planned colonization effort that involved hundreds of ships and thousands of settlers. These were not desperate refugees, but prosperous farmers and craftsmen who were willing to risk everything for the opportunity to create a new society free from the political constraints of their homeland. The Icelandic settlement was unique in medieval Europe, a conscious attempt to create a new society based on democratic principles and the rule of law. The Althing, established in 930 CE, was one of the earliest parliaments in European history, a democratic assembly where free men could gather to make laws and settle disputes. The legal code that emerged from these assemblies was remarkably sophisticated, balancing individual rights against collective responsibilities in ways that would not be matched in most of Europe for centuries to come. From Iceland, Viking explorers pushed even further west, discovering and settling Greenland in the 980s. Eric the Red, the charismatic leader of the Greenland colony, understood the importance of marketing in attracting settlers to his new territory. The name Greenland was itself a piece of medieval advertising, designed to make the harsh Arctic environment seem more appealing to potential colonists. Despite the challenges of the climate, the Greenland settlements prospered for several centuries, developing a unique culture that blended Scandinavian traditions with adaptations to their Arctic environment. The ultimate Western achievement of Viking exploration was the discovery of North America, which they called Vinland. Around 1000 CE, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, led an expedition that landed somewhere on the North American coast, making the Vikings the first Europeans to set foot in the New World. While the North American settlements were ultimately unsuccessful, they represented the farthest extent of medieval European exploration, achieved 5 centuries before Columbus. Meanwhile, in the east, other Viking groups were pioneering trade routes that would connect Scandinavia to the riches of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. The rivers of Russia became highways for Viking merchants, who established trading posts at strategic points along the Volga and Dnieper. The city of Novgorod became a major center of this eastern trade, while Kiev emerged as the capital of a Rus state that would eventually become the foundation of both Russia and Ukraine. The eastern expansion was different in character from the western adventures. While the Western Vikings were primarily farmers and warriors seeking land and glory, the Eastern Vikings were merchants and diplomats seeking profit and political influence. They established themselves as an aristocratic elite in Slavic societies, ruling over vast territories and commanding enormous wealth. The Varangian Guard, elite Viking warriors who served the Byzantine emperor, represented the pinnacle of this eastern expansion, demonstrating how far Viking influence had spread by the 10th century. The scale of Viking trade networks was truly remarkable. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking merchants were trading across distances that would not be matched again until the age of European exploration. Silver from the Islamic world, silk from Byzantium, walrus ivory from Greenland, and amber from the Baltic shores all flowed through Viking trading centers. These weren't merely luxury goods, but essential components of a sophisticated economic system that connected the Arctic to the Mediterranean, the Atlantic to the Caspian Sea. The social organization that made this expansion possible was equally sophisticated. Viking society was remarkably flexible in its approach to leadership and governance. While traditional monarchy existed, it was balanced by strong democratic traditions that allowed for collective decision-making and individual initiative. The Thing assemblies that governed local communities were replicated in new settlements, creating a system of governance that could adapt to local conditions while maintaining essential cultural continuity. The role of women in Viking expansion was more significant than in most medieval societies. While men dominated the military and political spheres, Women played crucial roles as settlers, traders, and cultural preservers. They were the ones who maintained the textile industries that provided valuable trade goods, who preserved the oral traditions that maintained cultural identity, and who often served as the practical administrators of new settlements while their husbands were away on trading expeditions. The religious dimension of Viking expansion was equally important. While the Vikings are often portrayed as purely secular in their motivations, their expansion was deeply influenced by their religious beliefs. The concept of fate, so central to Norse mythology, gave them a particular attitude toward risk and adventure. If one's destiny was predetermined, then there was no point in avoiding danger. The only honorable course was to face whatever challenges arose with courage and determination. The gradual conversion to Christianity that began in the 10th century didn't end Viking expansion, but rather transformed it. Christian Vikings were more likely to be accepted by European societies, making trade and settlement easier. The conversion also brought Vikings into contact with more sophisticated systems of governance and administration, skills that they readily adopted and adapted to their own needs. By the end of the 10th century, Viking influence extended across an area larger than the Roman Empire at its height. From the Viking settlements in Greenland to the Rus principalities in Russia, from the Norman domains in France to the trading posts of the Black Sea, the descendants of Scandinavian seafarers had created a network of interconnected societies that bridged the gap between the ancient and medieval worlds. This expansion was not without its costs. The same mobility that made Viking expansion possible also made it difficult to maintain unified control over scattered settlements. Communication across such vast distances was slow and unreliable, leading to the gradual development of distinct regional cultures. The Viking world was becoming too large and diverse to be governed from any single center, setting the stage for the political fragmentation that would characterize the later medieval period. But the achievements of the Viking expansion were undeniable. In the space of less than 2 centuries, a collection of Scandinavian farming communities had transformed themselves into a civilization that spanned continents and connected previously isolated regions. They had demonstrated that the barriers between different worlds were not as insurmountable as they had seemed, that with sufficient courage, skill, and determination, even the most ambitious dreams could be realized. The age of expansion was reaching its peak, but already the seeds of transformation were being sown. The same forces that had driven Viking expansion were beginning to create the conditions for a new phase of development, one that would see the raiders and explorers of the 9th and 10th centuries evolve into the merchants and kings of the 11th and 12th centuries. The greatest adventures still lay ahead, but they would be adventures of a different kind. The challenge of building lasting institutions from the achievements of the heroic age. Behind the dramatic narratives of raids and conquests, behind the tales of heroes and kings that have captured the imagination of generations, lay the quieter but equally remarkable story of Viking society itself. A complex tapestry of relationships, responsibilities, and cultural practices that sustained one of medieval Europe's most dynamic civilizations. To understand the Vikings truly, we must look beyond the battlefield and the longship to the hearth and the marketplace, to the intimate spaces where families lived, worked, and dreamed of the future. The foundation of Viking society was not the warrior band or the royal court, but the household, that basic unit of production, consumption, and cultural transmission that determined how individuals would live, work, and understand their place in the world. These households were far more complex than our modern nuclear families, encompassing not just parents and children, but often grandparents, unmarried siblings, servants, and even slaves. The boundaries between family and community were fluid, creating networks of mutual obligation and support that extended far beyond the immediate household. At the heart of each household stood the marriage bond, but this was not the romantic ideal of modern times. Viking marriages were strategic alliances that connected families, consolidated property, and ensured the continuation of bloodlines. Yet within these practical arrangements, there was room for affection, respect, and partnership. The sagas tell us of couples who faced life's challenges together, who supported each other through triumph and tragedy, who found in marriage not just economic security, but emotional fulfillment. The position of women in Viking society was remarkably progressive for its time. While men dominated the public spheres of warfare and politics, women wielded significant authority within the household and the broader community. They could own property, initiate divorce, and participate in the legal proceedings that governed community life. The keys that wealthy women wore at their belts were not merely functional tools, but symbols of their authority over the household economy. When a woman died, these keys were often buried with her, testament to the importance of her role in maintaining the complex web of relationships that sustained Viking society. The vulva, or female seer, held a position of particular reverence in Viking culture. These women were believed to possess the gift of prophecy, the ability to see beyond the veil that separated the world of the living from the realm of the dead and the divine. They traveled from community to community, consulted by both powerful chieftains and ordinary farmers about everything from upcoming weather patterns to the outcomes of important ventures. The respect accorded to these women reveals something profound about Viking attitudes toward gender and power. That wisdom and spiritual authority were not exclusively male domains, but could be embodied by anyone who possessed the necessary gifts and training. The daily life of Viking women was both challenging and rewarding. They managed complex households that often included dozens of people, overseeing everything from food preparation and textile production to the education of children and the care of the elderly. The spinning and weaving that occupied so much of their time was not merely domestic drudgery, but skilled craftsmanship that produced goods essential to their family's survival and prosperity. The fine textiles produced by Viking women were highly valued trade goods sought after across medieval Europe for their quality and beauty. Children in Viking society were treasured not just as future adults, but as sources of joy and meaning in the present. The naming ceremonies that welcomed newborns into the community were elaborate affairs that connected each child to their ancestors and their destiny. Children were given names that reflected their parents' hopes and dreams, names that honored heroic ancestors, invoked the protection of the gods, or expressed wishes for prosperity and happiness. The relationship between parents and children was warm and affectionate, as evidenced by the numerous runestones erected by grieving parents to commemorate children who had died young. The education of Viking children was a communal responsibility that extended far beyond the immediate family. Boys learned the skills of farming, craftsmanship, and warfare from their fathers and older male relatives, while girls mastered the complex arts of household management, textile production, and the preservation of cultural knowledge. But both boys and girls were expected to memorize the great stories of their people, to understand the laws and customs that governed their society, and to develop the judgment and wisdom that would serve them as adults. The concept of kinship in Viking society extended far beyond blood relationships to encompass complex networks of obligation and loyalty. The extended family, including cousins, in-laws, and even close friends, formed a support network that provided security in times of trouble and assistance in times of opportunity. These kinship networks were particularly important in the context of Viking expansion, as they provided the social foundation for new settlements and trading ventures. A successful raid or trading expedition was not just an individual achievement, but a family enterprise that benefited an entire network of relatives and allies. The legal system that governed Viking society was remarkably sophisticated in its understanding of family relationships and obligations. The concept of wergild, the compensation paid to the family of a murder victim, reflected the understanding that violence against one individual was violence against an entire kinship network. The complex inheritance laws that divided property among multiple heirs were designed to maintain family solidarity while preventing the concentration of too much wealth in any single person's hands. These laws were not imposed from above by distant rulers, but emerged from the collective wisdom of the community, reflecting centuries of experience in managing the tensions between individual ambition and collective welfare. The seasonal rhythms that governed Viking life created natural opportunities for community bonding and cultural transmission. The long winter months, when outdoor work was impossible, became times for storytelling, craftsmanship, and the strengthening of social bonds. Families would gather around their hearths not just for warmth, but for the sharing of memories, the teaching of traditional skills, and the planning of future ventures. These intimate gatherings were where the culture truly lived, where values were transmitted from generation to generation, and where the bonds of community were renewed and strengthened. The religious life of Viking families was deeply integrated into their daily existence. The household gods, the small statues and amulets that protected the family from harm, were not distant deities but intimate presences that shared in the family's joys and sorrows. The seasonal festivals that marked the turning points of the year were family celebrations as much as community events, times when the bonds between the living and the dead were renewed and strengthened. The ancestors were not forgotten, but remained active participants in family life, their wisdom sought in times of difficulty and their approval craved in times of success. The impact of Viking expansion on family life was profound and complex. The long absences of men on raiding and trading expeditions placed enormous burdens on the women who remained behind, forcing them to assume responsibilities that might normally have been shared. At the same time, the wealth and opportunities created by successful ventures allowed families to improve their living conditions, to provide better educations for their children, and to secure their position in the community. The expansion also created new possibilities for family advancement, as successful raiders and traders could establish themselves in positions of leadership and influence. The gradual conversion to Christianity brought significant changes to Viking family life, but these changes were often subtle and gradual rather than dramatic. Christian marriage ceremonies replaced pagan rituals, but the essential structure of Viking families remained largely unchanged. The new religion placed greater emphasis on the nuclear family and the authority of the father, but it also reinforced many traditional values such as the importance of hospitality, the obligation to care for the poor and elderly, and the sanctity of the marriage bond. The establishment of new settlements during the Viking expansion often required the reconstruction of family and community structures in unfamiliar environments. The settlers who established the Icelandic colony, for example, had to create new forms of social organization that could function effectively in their new homeland while maintaining essential connections to their cultural heritage. The success of these settlements depended not just on the courage and skill of individual pioneers, but on the strength of the family and community bonds that provided the social foundation for new societies. As the Viking Age progressed, the nature of family life began to change in response to new challenges and opportunities. The rise of more centralized political structures reduced the autonomy of individual families, while providing new forms of security and stability. The growth of towns and cities created new economic opportunities, but also new social tensions as traditional rural communities gave way to more complex urban societies. The increasing integration of Scandinavian societies into the broader European world brought new ideas and influences that challenged traditional ways of life. Yet through all these changes, the essential values that had sustained Viking families for generations continued to provide meaning and direction. The emphasis on honor, courage, and loyalty that characterized Viking culture was not just a warrior ethos, but a family ethic that governed relationships between spouses, parents, and children, and extended kin. The commitment to collective welfare that made Viking expansion possible was rooted in the countless daily acts of cooperation and mutual support that characterized Viking family life. The legacy of Viking family structures can be seen in the democratic traditions and social values that continue to characterize Scandinavian societies today. The emphasis on gender equality, the commitment to collective welfare, and the balance between individual freedom and social responsibility that define modern Nordic culture all have their roots in the family structures and community bonds that sustained Viking civilization more than 1,000 years ago, far from the popular image of Vikings as mere raiders and warriors. The reality of Scandinavian expansion reveals a civilization driven as much by commerce as by conquest, one that created some of the most sophisticated and far-reaching trade networks in medieval history. The same ships that carried Viking warriors to distant shores also transported merchants and craftsmen, carrying goods and ideas across distances that would not be matched again until the age of European exploration. To understand the Vikings truly, we must follow the silver trails that connected their northern homeland to the riches of the known world. The foundations of Viking commerce lay in the natural resources of Scandinavia itself. The forests that covered much of the region provided not just timber for shipbuilding, but also the raw materials for a thriving woodworking industry. Viking craftsmen created everything from simple household items to elaborate decorative objects, their work characterized by a distinctive artistic style that combined practical functionality with sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. The amber that washed up on Baltic beaches was particularly prized, its golden translucence making it one of the most sought-after luxury goods in medieval Europe. The northern seas provided their own bounty. The walrus colonies of the Arctic islands yielded ivory that was prized throughout the medieval world, while the seal hunts that took place during the brief Arctic summer provided oil for lamps and leather for countless practical uses. The fishing grounds off the Norwegian coast were among the richest in medieval Europe, and the techniques developed for preserving and transporting fish became a cornerstone of Viking commerce. The stockfish cod dried in the cold northern air became a staple food throughout medieval Europe, carried by Viking merchants to markets as distant as the Mediterranean. But the Vikings were not merely exporters of raw materials. They were also skilled manufacturers who added value to imported goods and created luxury items that were prized throughout the medieval world. The metalworking traditions that had created the legendary Viking weapons were equally adept at producing jewelry, decorative objects, and household items of exceptional quality. The silver arm rings that served as currency in much of the Viking world were not just stores of value, but works of art, their intricate patterns reflecting the sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities of their creators. The transformation of Viking society from a primarily agricultural to a commercial civilization was perhaps most evident in the trading centers that emerged throughout the Scandinavian world. Birka, located on an island in Lake Mälaren west of modern Stockholm, became one of the most important commercial centers in medieval Europe. Archaeological excavations have revealed a cosmopolitan community where merchants from across the known world gathered to exchange goods and ideas. The diversity of objects found at Birka, silk from China, spices from the Indian Ocean, silver from the Islamic world, glassware from the Rhine Valley, testifies to the global reach of Viking commerce. Hedeby, located at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, served as the gateway between the Scandinavian world and the rest of Europe. This strategically located trading center controlled the narrow isthmus that connected the Baltic and North Seas, making it a natural stopping point for merchants traveling between different regions. The town's cosmopolitan character was evident in its diverse population, which included not just Scandinavians but also Slavs, Germans, and even merchants from distant lands. The tolerance and pragmatism that characterized Viking commerce is evident in the peaceful coexistence of different cultures and religions within these trading centers. The eastern expansion of Viking commerce was particularly remarkable, as Scandinavian merchants established trading posts and political centers throughout the river systems of Russia. The Volga route connected Scandinavia to the riches of the Islamic world, while the Dnieper route provided access to the Byzantine Empire and the wealth of Constantinople. These were not merely trading expeditions, but complex diplomatic and military ventures that required enormous skill and resources to execute successfully. The city of Novgorod became the center of this eastern trade, a cosmopolitan metropolis where Viking merchants established themselves as a ruling elite among the Slavic population. The archaeological record from Novgorod reveals a society of remarkable sophistication, with evidence of literacy, complex legal systems, and extensive international connections. The birch bark documents that have been preserved in the city's wet soil provide fascinating glimpses into the daily life of medieval merchants, recording everything from business transactions to personal letters. The relationship between Viking raiders and Viking merchants was more complex than might be imagined. Often, the same individuals who participated in raids during the summer months would engage in peaceful trade during the winter. The knowledge gained from military expeditions, detailed information about coastlines, political conditions, and economic opportunities proved invaluable for commercial ventures. The reputation for military prowess that preceded Viking merchants often made their trading partners more accommodating, while the wealth gained from successful raids provided the capital necessary for large-scale commercial ventures. The commercial networks established by Viking merchants were remarkably sophisticated in their organization and scope. The standardization of weights and measures, the development of credit systems, and the establishment of commercial law all demonstrate a level of economic sophistication that rivaled the most advanced societies of the medieval world. The silver economy that developed throughout the Viking world was based on weight rather than coinage, allowing for flexible transactions that could adapt to local conditions while maintaining universal standards of value. The cultural impact of Viking commerce was perhaps even more significant than its economic effects. The trade routes that connected Scandinavia to the rest of the world also served as conduits for the exchange of ideas, technologies, and artistic influences. The distinctive Viking art style, with its intricate interlaced patterns and mythological motifs, shows clear influences from Byzantine, Islamic, and Celtic sources. The stories told by returning merchants, filled with descriptions of distant lands and exotic peoples, became part of the oral tradition that enriched Viking culture. The role of women in Viking commerce was more significant than in most medieval societies. While men dominated the long-distance trading expeditions, women played crucial roles in the production of trade goods, the management of local markets, and the administration of commercial enterprises. The textile industry, which was largely under female control, produced some of the most valuable trade goods in the Viking world. The fine woolens and linens created by Viking women were sought after throughout medieval Europe, their quality and beauty making them valuable diplomatic gifts as well as commercial commodities. The conversion to Christianity brought significant changes to Viking commerce, but these changes were often beneficial rather than disruptive. Christian merchants were more likely to be accepted in European markets, while the new religion's emphasis on honesty and fair dealing actually enhanced the reputation of Viking traders. The monasteries that were established throughout the Viking world became centers of learning and commerce, their scriptorium producing the manuscripts that recorded commercial transactions and legal agreements. The development of urban centers throughout the Viking world was closely linked to the growth of commerce. Towns like York, Kiev, and Dublin began as trading posts, but evolved into major urban centers that served as focal points for regional economies. These cities were characterized by their diversity and cosmopolitan character, with populations that included not just Scandinavians, but also representatives of many different cultures and religions. The tolerance and pragmatism that characterized Viking commerce created environments where different peoples could coexist and prosper together. The technological innovations that supported Viking commerce were as important as the organizational and cultural developments. The improvements in shipbuilding that made long-distance travel possible were complemented by advances in navigation, metallurgy, and manufacturing. The development of specialized trading vessels, designed for cargo capacity rather than speed, reflected the growing importance of commerce in Viking society. These ships were able to carry larger quantities of goods over longer distances, making previously unprofitable trade routes economically viable. The decline of Viking commerce was as gradual as its rise, reflecting changes in the broader European economy rather than any sudden collapse. The rise of centralized monarchies throughout Europe led to the establishment of more regulated trade systems, while the growth of alternative trade routes reduced the importance of the networks that had made Viking merchants so successful. The increasing integration of Scandinavian societies into the broader European world also meant that Viking merchants were no longer operating as outsiders, but as part of a larger commercial system. Yet the legacy of Viking commerce continued to influence European economic development long after the Viking Age had ended. The commercial techniques and organizational methods developed by Viking merchants were adopted by their successors, while the trade routes they had established continued to be used by later generations. The emphasis on international trade, technological innovation, and cultural exchange that characterized Viking commerce became defining features of Scandinavian civilization, contributing to the development of the prosperous and outward-looking societies that characterize the Nordic countries today. The story of Viking commerce reminds us that the medieval world was far more interconnected than is often imagined. The same forces that drove Viking expansion, curiosity about the wider world, willingness to take risks, and the ability to adapt to new circumstances, also made them successful merchants and cultural ambassadors. Their legacy lies not just in the dramatic tales of raids and conquests, but in the quieter but equally important story of how commerce and cultural exchange helped to create the interconnected world that we inhabit today. In the quiet moments between dawn and daybreak, when the mist still clung to the sacred groves and the first light of day began to filter through the ancient oaks, the people of the North communed with forces far older and more mysterious than the kingdoms and empires that rose and fell around them. The spiritual world of the Vikings was not a distant realm of abstract theology, but a living, breathing reality that permeated every aspect of their existence. To understand these remarkable people, we must enter their sacred spaces, walk among their gods, and listen to the whispered wisdom of the runes. The Norse cosmos was a complex, interconnected web of 9 worlds, each with its own inhabitants, its own challenges, and its own role in the great cosmic drama that would ultimately culminate in Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. At the center of this vast universe stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense ash whose roots extended into the deepest wells of wisdom and whose branches supported the very heavens. This was not merely a mythological concept, but a lived reality for the Vikings, who saw the sacred in every great tree, every ancient grove, every place where the earth reached toward the sky. The gods who inhabited this cosmos were not distant, perfect beings dwelling in some remote paradise. They were deeply flawed, passionate, and mortal figures who faced many of the same challenges as their human worshippers. Odin, the Allfather, was a complex deity who embodied both wisdom and deception, creation and destruction. His relentless quest for knowledge had led him to sacrifice his eye for a drink from the well of wisdom, to hang himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, to discover the secrets of the runes, and to wander the world in various disguises, testing the character of mortals. He was a god who understood that true wisdom came only through suffering, that power carried a heavy price, and that even the divine were subject to fate. Thor, the Thunderer, represented a different but equally important aspect of the divine nature. Where Odin was subtle and complex, Thor was straightforward and reliable. His hammer Mjolnir was not just a weapon, but a tool of blessing and protection, used to hallow marriages and ensure the fertility of the fields. Thor's battles with the giants were not mere entertainment but cosmic struggles between order and chaos, civilization and wildness. When Vikings wore miniature hammer pendants, they were not just expressing religious devotion, but claiming protection from the forces that threatened their world. Freya and Freyja, the twin deities of fertility and prosperity, governed the life-giving forces that made survival possible in the harsh northern climate. Freya, with his golden boar and his ship that could sail through air as well as water, ensured the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the people. Freyja, the most beautiful of the goddesses, presided over love, beauty, and the fate of fallen warriors. A great hall Folkvang was said to receive half of those who died in battle, sharing this honor with Odin's Valhalla. These deities were not abstract concepts, but intimate presences who could be petitioned for help, honored with offerings, and expected to take an active interest in human affairs. The practice of Sida, the form of magic associated particularly with Freyja and the vulva, reveals much about Viking attitudes toward the supernatural. This was not magic in the theatrical sense, but a sophisticated system of spiritual practice that involved altered states of consciousness, prophecy, and the ability to influence events through spiritual means. The vulva, or female seer, was a figure of enormous respect and sometimes fear, believed to possess the ability to see beyond the veil that separated the living from the dead. These women traveled from community to community, consulted by chieftains and common folk alike about everything from the weather to the outcome of important ventures. The runes themselves were far more than a simple writing system. Each rune was believed to embody a fundamental force or concept, making the act of writing a form of magic in itself. The runic alphabet, known as the Futhark after its first 6 letters, contained within it the essential wisdom of the universe. To carve runes was to tap into these primal forces, to create connections between the visible and invisible worlds. The rune stones that dotted the Scandinavian landscape were not mere monuments, but magical objects that could provide protection, commemorate the dead, and proclaim the power of those who erected them. The seasonal festivals that marked the turning points of the year were not just social gatherings, but profound spiritual events that renewed the connections between the community and the divine forces that governed their world. The winter solstice, celebrated as Yule, was a time when the barriers between the worlds were thinnest, when the dead could return to visit the living, and when the gods themselves might appear in human form. The great fires that burned during these festivals were not merely sources of warmth and light, but sacred flames that drove away the forces of darkness and chaos. The summer solstice was equally important, a celebration of the sun's triumph over darkness and the life-giving forces at their peak. The maypole dances and fertility rituals that characterized these celebrations were not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated expressions of the fundamental truth that human prosperity depended on the continued fertility of the natural world. The blot, or sacrificial feast, that often accompanied these festivals was a form of communion between the human and divine realms, a sharing of food and drink that strengthened the bonds between gods and mortals. The concept of fate, or word, was central to Viking spiritual understanding. This was not a fatalistic acceptance of predetermined destiny, but a complex understanding of the interconnected nature of all actions and consequences. The Norns, the 3 sisters who were said to weave the fates of gods and mortals alike, were not arbitrary forces, but expressions of the fundamental truth that every action had consequences that rippled through time and space. This understanding gave Vikings a particular attitude toward death and danger. Since one's fate was already determined, the only honorable course was to meet whatever challenges arose with courage and dignity. The conversion to Christianity, which began in earnest during the 10th century, was not a sudden replacement of one religious system with another, but a gradual process of synthesis and adaptation. Many Vikings found in Christianity elements that resonated with their existing beliefs: the concept of a divine sacrifice, the promise of resurrection, the importance of moral behavior. The cross and the hammer often appeared together on the same artifacts, suggesting that many Vikings saw no fundamental contradiction between their old and new faiths. The sagas that were written down during the Christian period often present a complex picture of religious transition. Characters might invoke both Christ and Odin in the same breath, or perform Christian rituals while maintaining traditional Norse burial practices. This religious syncretism was not a sign of confusion, but of a sophisticated understanding that different spiritual traditions might offer different insights into the same fundamental truths. The role of the skald, or court poet, was crucial in preserving and transmitting the spiritual wisdom of the North. These skilled artists were not mere entertainers, but keepers of cultural memory, responsible for maintaining the complex web of stories, genealogies, and moral teachings that gave meaning to Viking society. The elaborate poetic forms they used, with their intricate patterns of alliteration and internal rhyme, were not just aesthetic devices, but mnemonic techniques that helped ensure the accurate transmission of sacred knowledge. The spiritual landscape of the Vikings was populated not just by gods and goddesses, but by a host of other supernatural beings. The Daesir, protective spirits associated with particular families or places, watched over the living and could provide guidance and protection in times of need. The Landvættir, spirits of the land itself, had to be propitiated and honored to ensure the prosperity of farms and settlements. The Alfar, or elves, were beautiful and powerful beings who could bring either blessing or curse, depending on how they were treated. The afterlife, as conceived by the Vikings, was not a single destination, but a complex realm with different possibilities for different types of people. Warriors who died in battle might go to Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until the final battle of Ragnarok. Others might find themselves in Hell, the realm of the goddess of the same name, which was not a place of punishment, but simply the destination of those who died of old age or disease. The ship burials that have been found throughout the Viking world suggest a belief that the dead needed to travel to reach their final destination. That death was not an end, but a journey to a new form of existence. The gradual decline of the old religion was not a sudden collapse, but a slow transformation that took place over several centuries. Christian kings and missionaries often worked to reinterpret, rather than simply replace, traditional beliefs, presenting Christ as a more powerful version of Odin or Thor, rather than a completely different type of deity. The old festivals were transformed into Christian holidays, the sacred groves were replaced by churches, and the runes were supplemented by the Latin alphabet. Yet elements of the old religion persisted long after the official conversion to Christianity. Folk beliefs about elves, trolls, and other supernatural beings continued to influence Scandinavian culture for centuries. The concept of fate remained important, though it was now interpreted through a Christian lens. The respect for nature and the changing seasons that had characterized Norse paganism found new expression in Christian feast days and rituals. The spiritual world of the Vikings reminds us that religion is not merely a matter of abstract belief, but a lived reality that shapes how people understand their place in the universe. The gods and goddesses of the North were not distant theological concepts, but intimate presences who shared in the joys and sorrows of human existence. The rituals and practices that honored these deities were not empty ceremonies, but meaningful acts that connected individuals to their community, their ancestors, and the fundamental forces that governed their world. As we reflect on this rich spiritual heritage, we can appreciate how the Vikings' understanding of the sacred influenced every aspect of their culture, from their approach to warfare and exploration to their concepts of law and justice. The courage that carried them across unknown seas, the wisdom that guided their decision-making, and the sense of honor that defined their character all drew from the deep wells of spiritual understanding that sustained their civilization for centuries. In the flickering light of the great hall, where the smoke from the central hearth mingled with the breath of assembled warriors and the shadows danced on ancient tapestries, the transformation of Viking society from loose tribal confederations to centralized kingdoms unfolded with all the drama and complexity of the sagas themselves. The evolution of political power in the Norse world was not a simple progression from chaos to order, but a delicate dance between competing forces. Individual ambition and collective welfare, traditional authority and innovative governance, local autonomy and centralized control. The earliest forms of Viking political organization were remarkably democratic by medieval standards. The thing assemblies that governed local communities were gatherings of free men who came together to make laws, settle disputes, and make collective decisions about matters that affected the entire community. These assemblies were not mere advisory bodies, but wielded real power, capable of overruling even the most powerful chieftains when justice demanded it. The concept of individual rights balanced against collective responsibility, so central to modern democratic thought, was already being worked out in these ancient gatherings. The chieftains who emerged as leaders in this system were not absolute rulers, but first among equals, men whose authority derived from their ability to command respect and loyalty rather than from inherited power or divine appointment. The great halls where these leaders held court were not palaces in the traditional sense, but community centers, where hospitality was extended to all who came in peace. The high seat from which the chieftain dispensed justice was both a practical piece of furniture and a sacred symbol, connecting the leader to the gods and ancestors who legitimized his authority. The transformation of these traditional leaders into kings was a gradual process that reflected the changing needs of Viking society. As communities grew larger and more complex, as trade networks expanded and military challenges intensified, the need for more centralized authority became apparent. The first Viking kings were often successful war leaders who had proven their ability to protect their people and lead them to victory. But military success alone was not sufficient. These emerging monarchs also had to demonstrate their ability to govern in peacetime, to mediate disputes, and to maintain the complex web of relationships that held society together. Harald Fairhair, who is traditionally credited with unifying Norway in the late 9th century, exemplified this new type of royal authority. The sagas tell us that Harald began his campaign of conquest motivated by love. He had sworn not to cut his hair until he had won the hand of a beautiful woman who had spurned him for lacking a kingdom. Whether or not this romantic motivation is historical, it reflects the understanding that Viking kingship was not just about power, but about the ability to inspire loyalty and devotion. Harald's success lay not just in his military prowess, but in his ability to transform defeated enemies into loyal allies, to create a sense of shared identity that transcended local loyalties. The institutional innovations that emerged during this period of royal consolidation were remarkably sophisticated. The lendermen, or landed men, who served as the king's representatives in distant regions, were not mere appointees, but skilled administrators who understood the delicate balance between royal authority and local autonomy. The hearth, or royal retinue, evolved from a simple warrior band into a complex court that included not just fighters, but skilled craftsmen, learned advisors, and diplomatic representatives. The king's law, which gradually supplemented and sometimes replaced local customs, was not imposed from above, but developed through negotiation and compromise with local leaders. The role of the queen in this emerging system was particularly significant. Viking queens were not mere ceremonial figures, but active participants in governance, often serving as regents during their husbands' absences and playing crucial roles in the diplomatic networks that held the kingdom together. The institution of the queen's household, with its own retinue and resources, provided a parallel structure of authority that could complement and sometimes challenge royal power. The most successful Viking kingdoms were those where the royal couple worked together as partners, each contributing their unique skills and perspectives to the challenges of governance. The expansion of Viking influence beyond Scandinavia created new challenges and opportunities for royal authority. The kings who ruled the Viking settlements in England, Ireland, and France had to adapt their traditional forms of governance to very different circumstances. They had to learn to work with existing local elites, to navigate complex networks of feudal obligation, and to balance the expectations of their Scandinavian followers with the needs of their new subjects. The most successful of these expatriate rulers were those who could synthesize Viking and local traditions, creating new forms of governance that combined the best elements of both systems. Cnut the Great, who ruled England, Denmark, and Norway in the early 11th century, represented the pinnacle of Viking royal achievement. His empire was not held together by brute force, but by a sophisticated understanding of the different political traditions that characterized his various domains. In England, he worked within the existing Anglo-Saxon system of governance, respecting local customs while gradually introducing Norse innovations. In Denmark, he maintained the traditional structures of royal authority while adapting them to the needs of a more centralized kingdom. His ability to move seamlessly between different political worlds demonstrated the remarkable adaptability that characterized Viking leadership at its best. The legal innovations that emerged during this period were equally important. The law codes that were developed in the various Viking kingdoms were not mere collections of punishments, but sophisticated attempts to balance competing interests and maintain social harmony. The concept of compensation rather than retribution, so central to Viking legal thinking, reflected an understanding that the goal of justice was not to inflict suffering, but to restore balance and maintain peace. The elaborate procedures for legal proceedings, with their emphasis on evidence and testimony, demonstrated a commitment to fairness that was remarkable for its time. The economic foundations of Viking kingship were complex and sophisticated. The kings who emerged during this period were not just military leaders, but skilled economic managers who understood the importance of trade, taxation, and resource allocation. The royal monopolies on certain goods, such as walrus ivory from Greenland or amber from the Baltic, provided steady sources of revenue that could fund military campaigns and administrative expenses. The standardization of weights and measures, the establishment of royal mints, and the creation of market towns all demonstrated the economic sophistication that characterized the best Viking kingdoms. The relationship between royal authority and the church was particularly complex during the period of Christian conversion. The Viking kings who converted to Christianity were not simply adopting a new religion, but were entering into a complex relationship with an international institution that had its own understanding of political authority. The most successful of these Christian kings were those who could maintain their traditional roles as protectors and providers while adapting to the new expectations that came with their Christian faith. The royal patronage of churches and monasteries was not just an expression of piety, but a political strategy that helped to legitimize royal authority and create new networks of support. The rise of towns and cities throughout the Viking world created new challenges for royal authority. These urban centers were not just commercial hubs, but focal points of political and cultural activity that could potentially challenge royal power. The kings who were most successful in managing these urban populations were those who could balance the need for central authority with respect for local autonomy. The guild systems that emerged in many Viking cities were not just economic organizations, but political institutions that mediated between royal authority and local interests. The military innovations that characterized this period were closely connected to political developments. The Ledung, or naval levy system, that was developed in Denmark and Norway was not just a military organization, but a sophisticated system of governance that connected military service to political participation. The obligation to provide ships and men for royal campaigns was balanced by the right to participate in the assemblies that made important decisions about war and peace. This system created a sense of shared responsibility that helped to legitimize royal authority while maintaining the democratic traditions that had characterized earlier Viking society. The cultural patronage that characterized Viking royal courts was equally important. The kings who could attract the best skalds, craftsmen, and scholars to their courts were not just displaying their wealth, but were creating the cultural foundations that would legitimize their authority and ensure their place in history. The great halls where these courts met were not just administrative centers, but cultural institutions that preserved and transmitted the values and traditions that defined Viking civilization. The gradual integration of Viking kingdoms into the broader European political system was both a challenge and an opportunity. The kings who could successfully navigate the complex world of medieval diplomacy, with its elaborate protocols, its shifting alliances, and its competing claims to authority, were those who understood that Viking success had always depended on adaptability and innovation. The conversion to Christianity, the adoption of continental legal and administrative practices, and the development of new forms of economic organization all reflected this fundamental adaptability. The legacy of Viking kingship was not just political, but cultural. The institutions that were developed during this period, the concept of limited monarchy, the balance between central authority and local autonomy, the integration of military and civilian leadership would influence the development of European political thought for centuries to come. The Scandinavian kingdoms that emerged from the Viking Age were not just successful political entities, but laboratories for political innovation that would contribute to the development of modern democratic thought. As we reflect on this remarkable period of political transformation, we can appreciate how the Viking achievement was not just one of military conquest or commercial expansion, but of political creativity. The kings and Jarls who guided this transformation were not just successful warriors, but skilled political architects who understood that lasting power had to be based on consent as well as force, on innovation as well as tradition, on the ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential values and principles. I'll continue from where you left off with section 10 and then complete the remaining sections of your Viking script, maintaining the calm, meditative tone perfect for bedtime listening. By the middle of the 11th century, the winds of change were beginning to blow across the Viking world, with a force that no longship could outrun and no shield wall could withstand. The very success that had carried Norse warriors and merchants to the far corners of the known world was now creating conditions that would ultimately transform their civilization beyond recognition. This was not the dramatic collapse that characterizes the end of some historical periods, but rather a gradual tide that would reshape the northern lands as surely as the glaciers had carved their fjords. The challenges that faced Viking society during this period were as complex as they were interconnected. The expansion that had brought wealth and glory to previous generations was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The monastery that had once been a defenseless target was now protected by stone walls and professional soldiers. The trading post that had once welcomed foreign merchants was now controlled by local rulers who demanded tribute and imposed restrictions. The political landscape of medieval Europe was changing, and the Vikings found themselves having to adapt to new realities or risk being left behind. The rise of centralized monarchies throughout Europe was perhaps the most significant challenge to traditional Viking activities. The fragmented political landscape that had made raiding so profitable was giving way to unified kingdoms with professional armies and sophisticated defensive systems. The English kings who had once paid tribute to Viking raiders were now strong enough to drive them from the land permanently. The Frankish rulers who had once been vulnerable to surprise attacks were now protected by elaborate fortification systems and standing armies. The transformation of the church from a collection of vulnerable monasteries to a powerful international institution also created new challenges for Viking society. The monasteries that had once been easy targets were now protected by papal authority and military orders. The Christian kings who had once been potential allies were now bound by religious obligations to oppose pagan raiders. The moral authority of the church was increasingly being used to legitimize resistance to Viking expansion and to portray the Norse as enemies of Christian civilization. The internal changes within Viking society were equally significant. The conversion to Christianity, which had been gradual and often superficial in its early stages, was now becoming more complete and more demanding. The new religion brought with it new moral codes, new political allegiances, and new ways of understanding the world. The old gods who had inspired generations of warriors were being replaced by a deity who preached peace and submission to earthly authority. Yet this transformation was not simply a matter of external pressure overcoming internal resistance. The Vikings themselves were actively participating in and shaping these changes. The same adaptability that had allowed them to thrive in diverse environments from Iceland to Constantinople now enabled them to navigate the transition from pagan raiders to Christian kingdoms. The Jarls who had once led successful raids were now founding monasteries and endowing churches. The warriors who had once sought glory in battle were now finding honor in pilgrimage and crusade. The economic foundations of Viking society were also undergoing fundamental transformation. The tribute and plunder that had sustained earlier generations were becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. The trade networks that had brought prosperity to Viking merchants were being reorganized under new political and religious authorities. The silver that had once flowed freely from the Islamic world was now being redirected through different channels controlled by different powers. The demographic changes within Scandinavian society reflected these broader transformations. The population that had once been dispersed across vast networks of settlements and trading posts was now being concentrated in fewer, more centralized locations. The mobility that had characterized Viking society was giving way to more settled patterns of life. The kinship networks that had once linked communities across oceans were being replaced by territorial allegiances and feudal obligations. The technological innovations that had made Viking expansion possible were also reaching their limits. The longship that had been such a revolutionary development was now being outpaced by larger, more sophisticated vessels. The weapons and armor that had given Viking warriors their edge were being matched and surpassed by their enemies. The navigation techniques that had enabled remarkable voyages of discovery were being codified and disseminated, removing the Vikings' exclusive advantages. The cultural synthesis that emerged from these challenges was neither purely Norse nor purely foreign, but something entirely new. The sagas that preserved ancient stories were now being written down in Christian monasteries. The legal codes that governed daily life were being influenced by both Germanic tradition and canon law. The artistic traditions that had once celebrated pagan gods were now being adapted to serve Christian purposes. The leaders who emerged during this period of transition were remarkable for their ability to bridge different worlds and different ways of life. They were equally at home in the great halls of their ancestors and the royal courts of Christian Europe. They could speak the ancient language of honor and kinship, while also understanding the new vocabulary of feudalism and divine right. They were, in many ways, the last true Vikings and the first truly medieval Scandinavians. As the 11th century progressed, it became increasingly clear that the age of expansion was drawing to a close. The horizons that had once seemed infinite were now clearly defined. The opportunities that had once seemed limitless were now carefully regulated. The freedom that had once characterized Viking society was now being channeled into new forms of service and obligation. Yet this transformation was not experienced as a loss by those who lived through it. For many, the new order offered stability and security that had been absent from the turbulent centuries of expansion. The Christian faith provided comfort and meaning that complemented rather than replaced the ancient values of courage and loyalty. The emerging kingdoms offered opportunities for service and advancement that were different from, but not necessarily inferior to, the adventures of earlier generations. The seeds of decline that were planted during this period would not bear fruit for several more centuries. The Viking spirit of adventure and innovation would continue to manifest itself in new forms, adapted to new circumstances. The cultural heritage that had been created during the Age of Expansion would continue to influence Scandinavian society long after the last longship had returned to port for the final time. The morning mist that rose from the harbour at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, carried within it the essence of an ending, not just the end of a battle, but the close of an entire epoch. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, stood tall in his armour as the English arrows found their mark, and with his fall, something ineffable passed from the world. The age of the Vikings was drawing to its close, not with the sudden violence of conquest, but with the gentle inevitability of autumn leaves surrendering to winter's approach. Harald Hardrada himself embodied the contradictions and complexities of this twilight period. He had served as a mercenary in the Byzantine Empire, travelled the known world, accumulated vast wealth, and ruled Norway with the authority of a medieval king. Yet he had also preserved the ancient dreams of conquest and expansion that had driven his ancestors across the northern seas. His death at Stamford Bridge was both an ending and a beginning, the end of the Viking dream of conquest and the beginning of a new chapter in which Scandinavian rulers would find their place within the broader tapestry of European civilization. The battle itself was fought with weapons and tactics that bridged two worlds. The English forces under Harold Godwinson represented the new order of professional armies and centralized authority. The Norwegian forces under Harald Hardrada represented the ancient tradition of warrior kings leading their followers in search of glory and plunder. The clash between these two forces was not merely military, but symbolic, representing the collision between an older world of personal loyalty and martial valor, and a newer world of institutional authority and systematic organization. The news of Harald Hardrada's death rippled across the Viking world like ripples on a still pond, carrying with it the recognition that an era had passed. The Jarls and kings who had looked to him as a model of the old ways now understood that the future lay in accommodation rather than confrontation, in adaptation rather than conquest. The young men who had dreamed of following him on raids and expeditions now turned their attention to more settled pursuits, to trade and diplomacy, to the building of kingdoms rather than the plundering of them. Yet the end of the Viking Age was not marked by dramatic battles alone. In the quiet halls of royal courts and the stone chambers of monasteries, a different kind of transformation was taking place. The sagas that had once been recited around campfires during long winter nights were now being carefully transcribed by monastic scribes. The legal codes that had been preserved in the memory of law speakers were now being written down in permanent form. The cultural heritage of the Viking Age was being preserved even as the social conditions that had created it were disappearing. The last Viking expeditions were characterized by a different spirit than those of earlier centuries. The men who sailed westward to Greenland and beyond were not seeking quick wealth or military glory, but rather new homes and opportunities for their families. The merchants who continued to traverse the northern seas were not adventurers seeking their fortune, but professional traders operating within established networks of commerce and diplomacy. The warriors who continued to serve in foreign armies were not freelance raiders, but skilled professionals offering their services to legitimate rulers. The transformation of Viking society during this period was reflected in the changing nature of its leaders. The kings and Jarls who emerged in the late 11th and early 12th centuries were different from their predecessors in fundamental ways. They were educated in Christian theology and canon law, as well as in the traditional skills of warfare and leadership. They maintained diplomatic relations with foreign courts and participated in the complex political networks that characterized medieval Europe. They founded monasteries and endowed churches with the same energy that their ancestors had devoted to planning raids and expeditions. The cultural synthesis that emerged from this transformation was neither purely Norse nor purely foreign, but something entirely new. The architectural styles that developed in Scandinavia during this period combined traditional northern building techniques with influences from Christian Europe. The literary works that were produced reflected both ancient oral traditions and contemporary theological concerns. The legal systems that were established incorporated both Germanic custom and Christian moral teaching. The economic foundations of Scandinavian society were also undergoing fundamental change. The wealth that had once come from raiding and tribute was now being generated through more systematic forms of trade and agriculture. The silver that had once flowed from the Islamic world was being replaced by new forms of currency and credit. The trading networks that had once been maintained by personal relationships and individual enterprise were now being organized under royal authority and ecclesiastical supervision. The demographic patterns that characterized the end of the Viking Age reflected these broader transformations. The population that had once been dispersed across vast networks of settlements and trading posts was now being concentrated in fewer, more centralized locations. The mobility that had characterized Viking society was giving way to more settled patterns of life. The kinship networks that had once linked communities across oceans were being replaced by territorial allegiances and feudal obligations. The spiritual life of Scandinavian society was also being transformed in fundamental ways. The ancient gods who had inspired generations of warriors were being replaced by a Christian deity who emphasized different values and different forms of heroism. The rituals and ceremonies that had once marked the passage of seasons and the celebration of victories were being adapted to serve new religious purposes. The worldview that had once seen fate as the ultimate arbiter of human destiny was being replaced by a theology that emphasized divine providence and human responsibility. The artistic traditions that had flourished during the Viking Age were not disappearing, but rather being transformed and adapted to serve new purposes. The intricate metalwork that had once adorned weapons and jewelry was now being applied to religious artifacts and ceremonial objects. The storytelling traditions that had once preserved the memory of ancient heroes were now being used to celebrate Christian saints and biblical figures. The poetic forms that had once praised the deeds of warriors were now being employed in the service of spiritual reflection and moral instruction. As the 12th century progressed, it became increasingly clear that the Viking Age was not ending in defeat or collapse, but rather in successful transformation. The Scandinavian kingdoms that emerged from this period of transition were not weak or backward, but rather vital and dynamic participants in the broader European community. The cultural heritage that had been created during the Age of Expansion continued to influence Scandinavian society, but now in forms that were compatible with the new social and political realities. The last Vikings were not failures or anachronisms, but but rather successful adapters who had found ways to preserve what was valuable in their ancient traditions while embracing the opportunities offered by a changing world. Their legacy would continue to influence Scandinavian society for centuries to come, not as a museum piece or romantic memory, but as a living tradition that continued to evolve and adapt to new circumstances and new challenges. In the quiet halls of museums and the careful excavations of archaeological sites, the material world of the Vikings continues to speak to us across the centuries, offering tangible connections to lives lived and stories told in ages long past. These artifacts, preserved in earth and ice, in bog and barrow, whisper their secrets to those patient enough to listen, revealing truth that no chronicle recorded and no saga preserved. The great ship burials discovered at Oseberg and Gokstad stand as monuments to the sophisticated craftsmanship and complex spiritual beliefs of Viking society. These vessels, preserved in the blue clay of Norwegian fjords, are not merely boats, but entire worlds in miniature, containing within their wooden embrace the tools and treasures, the hopes and fears of a vanished civilization. The intricate carvings that adorn their prows speak of artistic traditions that combine technical mastery with spiritual symbolism, creating objects that were simultaneously functional and sacred. The everyday artifacts recovered from Viking settlements across the North Atlantic reveal the intimate details of daily life that no heroic poem would think to record. The bone combs found in Greenlandic middens, worn smooth by countless hands, speak of personal vanity and social status that transcended the harsh realities of Arctic survival. The glass beads discovered in Icelandic farmsteads, traded across half the known world, tell stories of commercial networks that connected the most remote settlements to the great markets of Europe and Asia. The weapons and armor that emerge from warrior graves carry within their metal forms the very essence of Viking military culture. The pattern-welded swords, with their distinctive serpentine designs, represent not merely tools of war, but symbols of social identity and personal honor. The elaborate helmets and mail shirts speak of a society that valued both protection and display, where the appearance of a warrior was as important as his skill in battle. The discoveries made in trading centers like Birka and Hedeby reveal the sophisticated commercial culture that sustained Viking expansion. The scales and weights found in merchants' houses, standardized across vast distances, demonstrate the mathematical precision that underlaid seemingly chaotic market transactions. The foreign coins discovered in Scandinavian hoards, minted everywhere from England to Samarkand, trace the roots of commerce that carried not just goods but ideas, technologies, and cultural influences across the medieval world. The runestones that dot the Scandinavian landscape serve as both monuments and messages, preserving in carved granite the voices of people who lived and died 1,000 years ago. These stones, raised to commemorate journeys, celebrate achievements, and mourn losses, represent a form of mass communication that predates printing by centuries. The inscriptions they bear, sometimes formal and ceremonial, sometimes intimate and personal, offer glimpses into the emotional lives of people who are often portrayed as purely martial in character. The archaeological evidence for Viking religious practices reveals a spiritual world far more complex than the dramatic mythology of gods and heroes. The temple sites discovered in Sweden and Denmark, with their careful alignments and ritual deposits, speak of sophisticated theological systems that governed both individual behavior and community life. The amulets and talismans found in graves and settlements reveal the everyday magic that helped people navigate the uncertainties of existence in a harsh and unpredictable world. The DNA evidence that has revolutionized our understanding of Viking migrations tells stories that traditional historical sources never recorded. The genetic traces of Scandinavian ancestry found in populations from Iceland to Ukraine reveal the true scope of Viking expansion and settlement. The evidence for female participation in these migrations challenges traditional assumptions about the masculine character of Viking society, showing that families, not just warbands, were the agents of cultural transmission. The environmental archaeology that has emerged from Viking settlements reveals the profound impact that these communities had on their landscapes. The pollen records preserved in lake sediments show how Viking settlers transformed forests into farmland, how they introduced new species and eliminated others, how they adapted their agricultural practices to diverse environments from the forests of Russia to the grasslands of Iceland. The preservation of organic materials in favorable conditions has provided unprecedented insights into Viking technology and craftsmanship. The textiles discovered in ship burials reveal sophisticated weaving techniques and complex patterns that speak of artistic traditions as developed as any in medieval Europe. The wooden artifacts preserved in waterlogged sites show the full range of Viking woodworking skills, from the elaborate carvings that adorned ceremonial objects to the simple tools that made daily life possible. The continuing discoveries made by modern archaeological techniques demonstrate that our understanding of Viking society is still evolving. The use of ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging has revealed previously unknown sites and structures, while isotope analysis of human remains has provided new insights into migration patterns and dietary practices. The application of experimental archaeology, in which modern craftspeople attempt to recreate Viking techniques and technologies, has provided new understanding of the practical skills that made Viking achievements possible. The conservation and display of Viking artifacts in museums around the world represents a form of cultural preservation that extends the life of these objects far beyond their original contexts. The careful climate control and security systems that protect these treasures ensure that future generations will be able to experience the same wonder and connection that draws visitors to museum galleries today. The digital revolution has transformed the study of Viking archaeology, making it possible to share discoveries instantaneously across the globe and to analyze finds using techniques that would have been impossible just decades ago. The three-dimensional scanning of artifacts allows researchers to examine details that would be invisible to the naked eye, while database systems enable the correlation of finds from sites thousands of miles apart. The archaeological legacy of the Vikings continues to grow with each new discovery, each new technique, each new insight into the material world they created and left behind. These artifacts serve as ambassadors from the past, carrying messages that transcend the limitations of language and time, speaking directly to our shared humanity and our common heritage as creators and storytellers, as builders and dreamers, as people who sought meaning and beauty in the midst of life's inevitable challenges and changes. The transformation of Viking history into modern myth represents one of the most fascinating journeys in cultural memory, a process by which the harsh realities of medieval life have been refined into stories that speak to contemporary longings and aspirations. In the gentle glow of reading lamps and the flickering light of cinema screens, the ancient Norse have been reborn as symbols of freedom, adventure, and authentic existence, their rough edges smoothed by centuries of retelling into forms that comfort and inspire modern audiences. The medieval sagas that first preserved Viking stories were themselves acts of cultural transformation, taking the oral traditions of a warrior society and reshaping them into literary works that could survive the transition from paganism to Christianity. The anonymous authors of these works, writing in the monasteries and royal courts of medieval Iceland and Norway, created a literary tradition that balanced historical memory with moral instruction, preserving the heroic values of the past while adapting them to the spiritual needs of their contemporary audiences. The Romantic movement of the 19th century discovered in Viking stories a powerful antidote to the constraints of industrial society and bourgeois respectability. Writers like William Morris and Matthew Arnold found in the Norse sagas a vision of authentic existence that seemed to offer an alternative to the mechanized world of their own time. The Vikings became symbols of natural nobility and primitive freedom, their violence romanticized as heroic adventure, and their paganism transformed into a kind of nature worship that appealed to readers seeking spiritual alternatives to conventional Christianity. The development of nationalism in 19th and 20th century Europe gave Viking stories new political significance, as different nations sought to claim the Norse heritage as their own. The Germanic peoples saw in the Vikings evidence of their own racial superiority and martial prowess, while the English claimed them as the founders of democratic institutions and commercial enterprise. The Scandinavian countries themselves developed complex relationships with their Viking heritage, sometimes embracing it as a source of national pride, and sometimes rejecting it as an embarrassing reminder of a barbarous past. The emergence of modern fantasy literature found in Viking mythology a rich source of inspiration for new forms of storytelling. Authors like J.R.R. Tolkien drew heavily on Norse sources in creating their imaginary worlds, while others like Paul Anderson and Michael Crichton used Viking settings to explore contemporary themes of survival, adaptation, and cultural conflict. The supernatural elements of Norse mythology proved particularly attractive to fantasy writers, who found in the stories of gods and monsters a mythology that was both exotic and accessible to Western audiences. The development of cinema brought Viking stories to life in ways that written literature never could, creating visual spectacles that emphasized the dramatic and adventurous aspects of Norse culture. The early sword and sandal films of the 1950s and 1960s presented Vikings as noble barbarians fighting against the corrupting influence of civilization, while later films explored more complex themes of cultural conflict and personal identity. The technical capabilities of modern filmmaking have made it possible to create increasingly realistic portrayals of Viking life, though these visual representations often reveal as much about contemporary values and concerns as they do about historical reality. The rise of television as a mass medium has given Viking stories new forms of expression and new audiences. Series like The Vikings and The Last Kingdom have brought Scandinavian history to millions of viewers around the world, creating ongoing narratives that can explore character development and cultural complexity in ways that feature films cannot. These productions often take considerable liberties with historical accuracy, but they serve the important function of keeping Viking stories alive in popular imagination and introducing new generations to the rich heritage of medieval Scandinavia. The digital revolution has transformed the ways in which Viking stories are told and consumed, creating new forms of interactive entertainment that allow audiences to participate in Norse adventures rather than merely observing them. Video games set in Viking worlds enable players to experience the challenges of medieval life firsthand, while online communities dedicated to Viking history and culture provide forums for enthusiasts to share knowledge and debate interpretations of the past. The modern revival of interest in Norse spirituality and mythology reflects a broader cultural search for authentic forms of religious expression that can provide meaning and connection in an increasingly secular world. The ancient gods and goddesses of Scandinavia have been rediscovered by people seeking alternatives to traditional Christianity, while the ethical systems embedded in Viking stories offer guidance for contemporary moral challenges. This spiritual revival often involves considerable adaptation and reinterpretation of ancient beliefs, but it demonstrates the continuing power of Viking culture to inspire and guide human behavior. The influence of Viking stories on modern popular culture extends far beyond explicit historical fiction and fantasy literature. The themes of adventure, exploration, and cultural encounter that characterize Viking narratives have become central elements in countless contemporary stories, from science fiction epics about space exploration to adventure films about modern treasure hunting. The The Viking model of the hero as an independent individual who creates his own destiny through courage and determination has become a fundamental archetype in Western storytelling. The academic study of Viking history and culture has also been influenced by popular representations of the Norse past, creating a complex dialogue between scholarly research and public imagination. Professional historians often find themselves responding to misconceptions created by popular media, while popular authors and filmmakers draw on academic research to create more authentic and nuanced portrayals of Viking life. This interaction between scholarship and popular culture has enriched both domains, creating more sophisticated historical knowledge and more informed popular entertainment. The global reach of modern media has made Viking stories accessible to audiences around the world, creating new forms of cultural exchange and interpretation. The Norse heritage is no longer confined to the Scandinavian countries, but has become part of a global cultural vocabulary that can be understood and appreciated by people from diverse backgrounds. This universalization of Viking stories has inevitably led to new forms of adaptation and reinterpretation, as different cultures find their own meanings and messages in the ancient tales of the North. The continuing appeal of Viking stories in modern culture reflects their ability to address fundamental human concerns that transcend historical periods and cultural boundaries. The themes of courage in the face of adversity, loyalty to family and friends, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world speak to universal human experiences. The Viking emphasis on personal honor and individual achievement resonates with contemporary values of self-reliance and personal responsibility, while their celebration of adventure and exploration appeals to modern longings for freedom and authentic experience. The transformation of Viking history into modern myth serves as a reminder of the power of storytelling to preserve and transmit cultural values across generations. The ancient tales of the North continue to evolve and adapt, finding new forms of expression and new audiences in each generation, ensuring that the Viking legacy remains a living presence in contemporary culture rather than a museum piece from the distant past. The gentle hum of wind turbines spinning against the backdrop of a Nordic sky carries within it echoes of ancient voyages. The same innovative spirit that once drove longships across unknown seas, now harnessing the power of nature to light modern homes. In the quiet efficiency of Scandinavian design, in the democratic traditions of Nordic governance, in the environmental consciousness that characterizes contemporary Scandinavian society, the essential qualities of Viking culture continue to manifest themselves in forms adapted to the needs and opportunities of the modern world. The democratic traditions that flourish in modern Scandinavian countries can trace their roots back to the ancient thing assemblies, where free men gathered to debate laws and settle disputes. The parliamentary systems that govern Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland today reflect the same principles of collective decision-making and individual participation that characterized Viking society. The emphasis on consensus building and compromise that marks Nordic politics represents a sophisticated evolution of the ancient practices by which dispersed communities maintained social cohesion without centralized authority. The social welfare systems that have made Scandinavian countries models of progressive governance reflect the ancient Nordic values of community responsibility and mutual support. The comprehensive healthcare, education, and social insurance systems that characterize modern Nordic societies represent institutional expressions of the same collective solidarity that once enabled Viking communities to survive and thrive in harsh environments. The balance between individual freedom and social responsibility that defines the Nordic model can be seen as a contemporary manifestation of the ancient Viking synthesis of personal honor and community loyalty. The environmental consciousness that characterizes modern Scandinavian culture reflects the deep connection to nature that has always been central to Nordic identity. The commitment to renewable energy, sustainable development, and environmental protection that marks contemporary Scandinavian policy represents a sophisticated evolution of the ancient understanding of human dependence on natural systems. The careful stewardship of forests, fisheries, and other natural resources that characterizes modern Nordic practice reflects the same practical wisdom that enabled Viking communities to maintain themselves in environments that demanded both adaptation and conservation. The design traditions that have made Scandinavian aesthetics influential around the world reflect the ancient Nordic appreciation for functional beauty and craftsmanship. The clean lines and natural materials that characterize modern Scandinavian design represent a contemporary expression of the same values that produced the elegant curves of Viking longships and the intricate patterns of Norse metalwork. The emphasis on simplicity, durability, and harmony with natural environments that marks Nordic design philosophy reflects a cultural continuity that spans more than a millennium. The technological innovations that have emerged from modern Scandinavian countries reflect the same spirit of practical problem-solving and adaptive ingenuity that characterized Viking culture. The leadership of Nordic countries in fields like telecommunications, biotechnology, and renewable energy represents a contemporary manifestation of the ancient Viking capacity for technological innovation and cultural adaptation. The willingness to embrace new technologies and explore their potential applications reflects the same openness to change and experimentation that enabled Viking expansion and settlement. The literary and artistic traditions that flourish in modern Scandinavian culture maintain clear connections to the ancient heritage of Norse storytelling and craftsmanship. The crime fiction that has made Scandinavian authors internationally famous reflects the same psychological insight and moral complexity that characterized the medieval sagas. The cinematic traditions that have emerged from countries like Sweden and Denmark demonstrate the same attention to character development and social criticism that marked ancient Norse literature. The contemporary art and music that emerge from Scandinavian countries often draw explicitly on ancient themes and symbols, creating new forms of expression that honor traditional heritage while addressing contemporary concerns. The international role that modern Scandinavian countries play in peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, and international development reflects the ancient Viking capacity for leadership and cultural influence. The prominent role of Nordic countries in organizations like the United Nations, NATO, and the European Union represents a contemporary expression of the same expansive vision that once drove Viking exploration and settlement. The commitment to international cooperation and peaceful conflict resolution that characterizes modern Nordic foreign policy reflects a sophisticated evolution of the ancient Viking understanding of the importance of maintaining relationships across cultural and geographical boundaries. The educational systems that characterize modern Scandinavian countries reflect the ancient Nordic emphasis on learning and cultural transmission. The comprehensive public education systems that provide equal opportunities for all citizens represent institutional expressions of the same democratic values that characterized ancient Thing assemblies. The emphasis on critical thinking, creativity, and practical skills that marks Nordic education reflects the same balance between intellectual development and practical competence that enabled Viking communities to adapt to diverse environments and challenges. The gender equality that characterizes modern Scandinavian society reflects the ancient Nordic tradition of women's participation in economic, social, and political life. The high levels of female participation in politics, business, and professional life that mark contemporary Nordic countries represent a contemporary expression of the same respect for women's capabilities and contributions that distinguished Viking society from many of its medieval contemporaries. The policies that support work-life balance and family welfare reflect the ancient understanding of the importance of maintaining strong family and community relationships. The economic systems that characterize modern Scandinavian countries reflect the ancient Nordic capacity for balancing individual enterprise with collective welfare. The mixed economies that combine market mechanisms with social protection represent sophisticated expressions of the same values that enabled Viking communities to maintain both individual freedom and social cohesion. The emphasis on innovation, entrepreneurship, and social responsibility that marks contemporary Nordic business culture reflects a cultural continuity that spans centuries of social and economic change. The continuing influence of Viking culture in modern Scandinavian society serves as a reminder that cultural heritage is not a museum piece, but a living tradition that continues to evolve and adapt to new circumstances. The essential qualities of courage, innovation, adaptability, and community solidarity that characterized Viking society continue to manifest themselves in contemporary Nordic culture, providing guidance and inspiration for addressing the challenges and opportunities of the modern world. The Viking legacy lives on not as a relic of the past, but as a continuing source of cultural identity and practical wisdom for navigating the complexities of contemporary life. As the last echoes of our journey through the Viking Age fade into the gentle silence of memory, we find ourselves returned to the place where we began, that timeless realm where the mist rises from dark waters and the ancient rhythms of human experience continue their eternal dance. The story of the Vikings, like all great historical narratives, is ultimately a story about ourselves, about the fundamental patterns of human aspiration and adaptation that connect us across the centuries to those who came before and those who will come after. In the rise and transformation of Viking civilization, we see reflected the eternal human struggle to create meaning and purpose in the face of an uncertain world. The Norse warriors who sailed into unknown waters were driven by the same fundamental needs that drive us today: the need for security and prosperity, the need for adventure and discovery, the need for recognition and remembrance. Their solutions to these universal challenges were shaped by their particular circumstances and cultural heritage, but the underlying motivations that drove them remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. The Viking emphasis on courage and honor speaks to something deep and permanent in the human spirit, a recognition that life's most important battles are often fought not against external enemies, but against the forces of despair, mediocrity, and moral compromise that threaten to diminish our humanity. The Norse understanding of fate and free will, of the complex relationship between individual agency and cosmic forces, offers insights that remain valuable for contemporary audiences seeking to understand their own place in the larger patterns of existence. The transformation of Viking society from a collection of raiding bands to a network of Christian kingdoms illustrates the eternal human capacity for adaptation and growth. The same flexibility and creativity that enabled the Vikings to thrive in environments as diverse as the Arctic tundra and the Mediterranean coast continue to characterize human responses to changing circumstances. The ability to preserve what is valuable in traditional culture while embracing new opportunities and challenges remains as important today as it was during the Viking Age. The Viking legacy in modern culture demonstrates the power of storytelling to transcend the limitations of time and space, to carry essential human truths across generations and cultures. The sagas that were first recited around medieval hearthfires continue to find new audiences and new forms of expression, proving that the fundamental human experiences of love and loss, triumph and tragedy, hope and despair, remain constant even as the surface details of life change beyond recognition. The archaeological evidence that continues to emerge from Viking sites reminds us that history is not a closed book, but an ongoing process of discovery and interpretation. Each new find, each new technique, each new insight adds to our understanding of the past and enriches our appreciation of the complex tapestry of human experience. The material remains of Viking civilization serve as tangible connections to people who lived and died centuries ago, reminding us that we are part of the same human story that included their struggles and achievements. The continuing influence of Viking culture in modern Scandinavian society illustrates the way in which cultural heritage can serve as a source of guidance and inspiration for contemporary challenges. The democratic traditions, environmental consciousness, and social solidarity that characterize modern Nordic countries represent sophisticated evolutions of ancient values, proving that cultural continuity does not require historical stagnation, but can instead provide the foundation for continued growth and adaptation. The global appeal of Viking stories in contemporary popular culture speaks to the universal nature of the themes they explore and the enduring power of narrative to provide meaning and connection in an increasingly fragmented world. The Vikings continue to capture imaginations around the world because their stories address fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between tradition and innovation that remain relevant regardless of cultural background or historical period. As we settle into the comfortable silence that follows the end of a long story, we carry with us the awareness that we are part of the same continuous narrative that included the Vikings and all the other peoples who have contributed to the rich tapestry of human civilization. Their courage in facing uncertainty, their creativity in solving problems, their commitment to family and community, and their capacity for growth and transformation remain available to us as sources of inspiration and guidance. The mist that rises from the water at dawn, the wind that stirs the trees at evening, the stars that shine in the dark sky above. These eternal phenomena witnessed the rise and transformation of Viking civilization, and they continue to witness our own struggles and achievements. In their constancy, we find comfort and perspective, a reminder that while individual lives and civilizations may pass away, the essential human qualities of courage, creativity, and community endure. The story of the Vikings, like all great stories, has no true ending, but rather returns us to the beginning, to the recognition that we are all part of the same eternal human journey, all sailors on the same vast ocean of existence, all seekers of meaning in the face of mystery, all participants in the ongoing adventure of human consciousness, exploring its own infinite possibilities. And so, as the gentle tide of sleep approaches, we rest in the knowledge that the courage and wisdom of those who came before us live on in our own hearts, guiding us forward into whatever adventures await in the vast, mysterious waters of tomorrow.